Please join me in prayer. Holy Spirit, you make your dwelling place within us, and from the inside you are able to change us. Continue to make us into people who answer evil with good. Amen. So thank you, Karen, for the extra reading. There's a lot in these readings, obviously. I'm not going to be able to touch on everything in even one of these readings. What I am going to focus on this morning for the sermon is what's often known as the problem of evil. The problem of evil. It's basically the idea that, or the question of why does evil happen and what should we do in response. And this isn't just enormous, global, make it on the news kinds of evil, right? In this case, evil could refer to, a war or a genocide or something horrific. Evil could also refer to just something that happens in your own life that's just the last straw. Have you ever experienced this or seen it happen to someone? Like, it isn't any particular thing that piles on top of you, but at some point it's just, it's too much. And it can cause the same kind of crisis of identity that something horrific can cause. Like, I've fallen apart myself. I have been with people who have fallen apart because of something that, taken on its own, is not that big a deal. But it can still lead to this collapse and this crisis and questioning of, why is this happening to me? Why did this happen? What am I supposed to do? Could I have done something differently? All of those are different expressions of what in theology and philosophy is the problem of evil. So a few points as we begin that I want to make, just to give you my viewpoint. Because this is one of those things that we could disagree on. That's fine. Obviously, I'm giving you my viewpoint in this case. Part of my viewpoint, the first thing I want to say, is that God does not cause evil. It isn't sometimes people talk as if God has an armload of calamity and suffering that God has to distribute in some way. And so God has some over here and some over there, and you get extra over here and you get this. I just don't think that's the case. To me, that doesn't fit with what I understand to be God's character, or even what it is to be good. So I don't think that God causes evil or causes suffering. God isn't there thinking, you know what, there's kind of a backlog of tsunamis, so I'm going to let one go, because it's time, right? At the same time, it's unavoidable to realize that God does not prevent all evil. Clearly, terrible things happen. They even happen to good people who don't deserve it. And that's also part of why there is a problem of evil. If evil happened, but it only happened to punish bad people, that wouldn't be a problem, right? That would feel kind of like justice. But evil's a problem because it happens sometimes to people who are a little deserving, and sometimes to people who are undeserving. And somehow we have to make sense of that. All of our readings today, the two from Genesis and the one from the Gospels, are responses to the problem of evil. That is one of the things that these readings are addressing. They address them in different ways, but they come to similar conclusions, which I thought was very interesting. Part of why I picked these out of the lectionary, so I could see a trajectory here. So these readings are about God's response to the problem of evil. What does God do about evil? And then also, by extension, what are we supposed to do about evil? How are we supposed to respond to it? Because those two things are never separated, I hope you realize. In this case, when I say evil, I also mean, you could say calamity, you could say misfortune. In the philosophical discussion of the problem of evil, they distinguish between moral evil and natural evil. Okay? And I won't be making that distinction, but just so you know, moral evil is something like a robbery or a murder. Moral evil is something a person does to other people or a person causes. Natural evil is something like an earthquake or cancer. Something that no particular person caused, right? But is still an evil. It still causes suffering and harm. But in this case, I think that God's response to both kinds of evil, as we'll see especially in the story of Joseph, is similar. And our response to both kinds of evil, I think, can also be similar. The last point I want to make as we go forward. One of the ways to reconcile the problem of evil individually is to feel like or to decide we just deserve it. So if something terrible happens to us, we can just have the feeling or make the decision that we've earned it somehow and take it on ourselves and treat it as if it is a moral punishment. Now, sometimes evil happens to us that's a direct consequence of our actions, right? We can see this happening all around us. People do things that are mistakes, and then bad things result. That's not what I'm talking about here. I'm talking about something that happens to us that we had no hand in causing. We could be a victim of another person, or we could be just experiencing a natural disaster or a health challenge. And because it's so painful to think about these issues sometimes, we might turn and say, well, I earned it, and make sense of it that way. But that to me is toxic. That's like ingesting poison. And over time it can poison us. And I'd like to talk about another way to make sense of this. And to stick to the question, what does God do in the face of evil? And then what can we do? So today we had two readings from the story of Joseph. I chose the two readings to try to give some context and to focus on the themes I wanted to talk about. But the story of Joseph is a pretty long story. There's a whole musical made about it, right, that some of us are familiar with. And so I just want to give like a brief recap of the story of Joseph. So Joseph is given an amazing Technicolor dream coat by his father. And he's enjoying his coat and living his best life, and his brothers become jealous. And so, because Joseph is the youngest, but he's getting special treatment. And so his brothers conspire against him, and they decide they're going to kill him. One of the things that they say is now an inscription next to the balcony where the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was shot. If you go to the Civil Rights Museum in Memphis, you walk through that hotel, and the tour ends at that balcony. And next to that balcony is an inscription that says, "Let us kill the dreamer, and then we shall see what becomes of his dreams." So Joseph is dreamy, and he has a Technicolor dream coat, and his brothers hate him for it. And they decide they're going to kill him. So they waylay him in the wilderness, and they can't bring themselves to just full-on fratricide. And so basically they shove him into a pit, and they create kind of a crime scene where they make it look like he was killed. And then they see some Egyptians coming who are famous slave traders. And so they say, okay, we're just going to leave him there. He'll get picked up as a slave. We don't have to worry about him. He's gone. They go back to their father and say, Dad, we've got some really bad news. Our beloved brother Joseph is dead. Meanwhile, Joseph is taken into slavery in Egypt. And Joseph, as he's in slavery in Egypt, begins working his way up through the Egyptian bureaucracy because he's a dreamer, remember. Joseph is able to interpret dreams. And Pharaoh has been troubled by this terrifying dream that none of his soothsayers can figure out. And so Joseph hears about this dream and he interprets it, and he says, this is what your dream means. We're going to have 7 years of plenty, and then we're going to have 7 years of famine. And so this is your warning to be able to prepare. And so Pharaoh is like, wow, Joseph, that's fantastic. He gets promoted from slave to servant in Pharaoh's household, and they begin making preparations in the 7 years of plenty for the 7 years of famine. Meanwhile, this famine is also striking the region. So there's famine in Judea to the east as well. And Joseph's father and his brothers and all the Hebrew people in the east are facing this famine and starving. And so they start coming west into Egypt as refugees, and there's Joseph. And among those refugees are his brothers, and so when they meet, that's our first reading this morning. Because his brothers are like, we are in a lot of trouble. I wonder if he holds a grudge. Unfortunately, Joseph doesn't. And then for the second reading, we have a particular Joseph quote that I wanted to capture. It's in verse 20 of our second reading. Joseph says, even though you intended to do harm to me, God intended it for good, in order to preserve a numerous people, as he is doing today. Because what happens is because Joseph is in Egypt, the Hebrew people are saved from starvation. Because Egypt is prepared, and they come as refugees and they live there. And so in this reading, what we see is that one way that God reacts to evil is that God uses evil to bring out good. God brings good out of evil. Joseph sees it. You intended evil, but God brought good out of it. Here in the story, we also have both moral evil and natural evil. The moral evil of Joseph's brothers betraying him and the natural evil of a famine. And out of both of these forms of evil, God brings good. Reconciliation for a family, and salvation from hunger for the Hebrew people and the people of Egypt. God is able to do this because Joseph remained faithful. Joseph is God's opportunity in this situation to bring the good out of evil. Joseph could have given up, could have fallen into bitterness, could have vowed revenge against his brothers. And if that had happened, God would have had to find another way. But Joseph remains faithful, and he continues looking for ways to serve. And he's able to serve his way up in the hierarchy by serving Pharaoh, by serving the Egyptians, who are ostensibly his enemies, starting off as his owners. And then he's finally able to serve his own people and save them. The other thing that Joseph had to do is he had to forgive. If Joseph had not forgiven his brothers, they'd be dead. If Joseph had not forgiven his father, he'd be dead. And so when his brothers showed up, Joseph had to forgive. And then through that faithfulness and that service and that forgiveness, God was able to bring good out of evil. What we can take from this for ourselves is in the midst of evil, what can we do? We can hold on. Trust that God's plan is to bring good out of the situation that we're in. Look for ways to serve. Remember I said with the children, look for the helpers. Be a helper. And we can forgive. The good that God brings out of evil in our lives won't necessarily be immediate. It might happen years from now. It might happen after the end of our lifetime. There are people who spent their entire life working for good that they never get to see. But part of that is the demand that we remain faithful, to trust God to do things we're not able to. Trust God to finish the work that we start. This passage from the Gospels from Luke that we read is one of my favorites in all of the New Testament and all of the Bible, really. Because this one and the parallel passage in the Gospel of Matthew that arranges things a little bit differently is where Jesus introduces something that I think Jesus is the first. At least he's the first that's easy to find historically. Jesus introduces the idea of nonviolent resistance. I mentioned Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. He is someone who picked up on this in part from Jesus. Jesus presents in this passage from Luke and the parallel passage in Matthew ways to resist nonviolently personal violence, to resist the violence of a legal system that is unjust, and in the passage from Matthew, to resist even a military occupation. And I'll go through at least the first two because they're found right here in Luke. First, a way to nonviolently resist interpersonal violence. So, Jesus says if someone strikes you on the right cheek, offer them the left also. So in context, this is not just encouraging people to assault you. In context, being struck on the right cheek would have been a backhand dismissive strike. And offering the left cheek makes another backhand awkward, if not impossible. And so what Jesus is doing is he's telling people a way to demand on their dignity. A backhand is something dismissive that you do to a lesser as a way to insult them and strip them of dignity. If you turn your other cheek, you have to kind of slap them forehand, which would be kind of feminine. So that'd be embarrassing. Or you have to punch them, which is what you do to an equal. This, of course, doesn't prevent you from being struck. But it's a way of demanding dignity in that context, in that cultural context, without hitting someone back or accepting their insult to you. It is not, as it has sometimes been interpreted, an invitation to accept abuse, to welcome people physically abusing you and not do anything in response. Jesus says that when someone sues you to take your outer clothing, give them your inner clothing as well. This is a response to their legal system at the time, which is very much our legal system now. It targets people in poverty, it strips them of dignity, it takes from people who have nothing. Our legal system does that now through things like cash bail, and it did that same thing then. You could literally be sued if you had nothing. You could be sued for your coat that you would sleep in at night because it gets cold in the desert. And so Jesus is saying, if someone is so cruel as to take you to court and to sue you for your coat, give them your shirt as well. See what happens. Turn a farce of justice into political theater. And now, because if you see someone unclothed, that makes you unclean, everyone is shouting and waving their arms and fleeing the courtroom, and you've made a mockery of something that should never be happening in the first place. Again, a way to resist evil with nonviolence. And Jesus has expanded these ideas as well, and many heroic people since have taken up these ideas in their own movements. But the giving someone if someone takes your coat, give them your undergarment or your shirt as well, is sometimes misinterpreted as be very generous. You've had people say sometimes that person would give you the shirt off their back, which is wonderful. It's good to be generous, but that's not what this means in the context. This is an act of resistance against injustice, against evil. None of these things that Jesus calls us to do are guaranteed to change the situation by themselves. If you turn the other cheek when you're struck, you're still being struck. If you are sued for your coat and you give them your shirt as well, you're still being sued for your coat. What these things do is they create an opening for good. The person striking you has an opportunity to realize you're a person of dignity. The person suing you for your coat has an opportunity to realize that they're doing something despicable. These movements and these actions aren't guaranteed success, but they open the door for good by answering evil with good. By resisting evil without becoming evil ourselves. Resisting being struck without striking back. God, for God's own reasons, allows evil. Even Jesus assumed that his disciples and apostles would be struck and threatened and placed on forced marches and sued and insulted and reviled and even killed. But God remains good in the midst of evil that occurs. And I think that God's response to evil is to bring good out of it. To use that evil as an opportunity to create good, possibly even good that could not have otherwise existed. Without Joseph experiencing evil, the Hebrew people could have starved. If Joseph had remained home to enjoy his Technicolor Dreamcoat, he would have been buried in that Dreamcoat. Or he would have had to cross into Egypt and throw himself on the mercy of people who enslave Hebrews. God works in all things to bring good out of evil. Whether it's a small evil in our life that's a last straw, whether it's an enormous, incomprehensible evil in the world, I think that God is working to bring good out of evil. And in turn, we too are called, when evil comes into our lives, not to return evil for evil, but wherever we can, to find ways to bring good out of it. And when we can't, to trust God to bring good out of evil, even when we cannot. Amen.